Hi, everyone. Welcome to the My Family Strategist podcast. This podcast is where we bring smart financial strategy to the chaos and overwhelm of parenting. I am your host, former chartered accountant and corporate strategist, Christina Spark. Deciding on childcare is not just a very emotional choice, but it is a very high stakes financial one. In Australia, the average family spends $23,000 per year net out of pocket expense on childcare. But if you are a high income earner, that can be upwards of $50,000 per year. So in this episode, I'm breaking down every major childcare model, from daycare to preschool, nannies, au pairs, and even the stay-at-home parent path. And what I'm looking to answer is, what is the actual total cost of each of these models, as well as some of the pros and cons. I'm also revealing some of the huge hidden costs of each of these models that a lot of people do not consider, like the fact that you might legally be on the hook for your nanny's super. And I'm also going to explain how the new 2026 Child Care Subsidy is an absolute game changer and can be saving families thousands of dollars per year. I'm also going to be answering a lot of questions you've probably been Googling at 2 a.m., like, when does it make more financial sense for one parent to actually quit their job and be stay at home? Can you really avoid daycare sickness, or are you just delaying the inevitable? Now, before we dive in, I have a quick but important note. The information in this episode is for general educational and entertainment purposes only. It does not take into account your personal objectives, financial situation, or specific needs. While I am a former accountant, I am not your accountant. Please seek independent professional advice from a licensed financial advisor or tax agent before making any decisions based on the content of this show. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Let's talk about daycares first. Daycares are for-profit professional centers focused on the early years learning framework, which is our national curriculum here in Australia for children from 0 to 5 years. You can think of daycares as the all-inclusive service model, and that is because they have very flexible hours, typically from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. So they cater for working parents who are doing that 9 to 5 plus a commute. They also include everything on site, so 5 chef-prepared meals per day. They typically provide nappies, wipes, sunscreen, all the crafts and supplies that they use at the center. Also, incursions are usually included in the price, which could be things like providing yoga or soccer on site. The daily rate does have quite a range. Where I am in Sydney, it's between $160 to $230 per day. So assuming you send your child 5 days a week at $200 a day, that's costing you about $1,000. But there are a few hidden costs to be aware of. The biggest one is public holidays. They do charge for the most part, meaning you have to still pay on Australia Day or Easter, even though the center is not open. Also, if you take sick days or any holidays, you still have to pay for those days even though you don't use them, which is kind of like a double whammy because they get all their sickness from daycare and then you have to pay when they are sick and they don't attend. But the biggest cost savings with daycare is that the government provides a Child Care Subsidy, which is known as CCS, and that's provided by Centrelink. So how much you actually pay out of pocket depends on your income. And CCS is something that you do not get with any of the other models that we're going to go through today. As of January 2026, the government included the 3-day guarantee, which is actually a very big change from the old model. Before, there used to be something known as an activity test, which means that you needed to have both parents working or studying in order to be eligible for your subsidy. And if you were a stay-at-home parent or casual or working part-time, less than 16 hours a week, you potentially were not getting hardly any subsidy at all. So the government has now changed that rule. And what they're effectively saying is that every single child deserves at least 3 days a week of childcare, regardless of what their parents are doing. The other change is that First Nations children are now guaranteed 5 days a week of subsidized childcare, regardless of parental activity. However, the CCS is still means tested. It was means tested before and it still is. And I think that is one point of confusion, is that this rule has not changed, which means there is an income cap. If your household earns more than $535,279 annually, you are not eligible for any subsidy. You get $0. And below that amount, it's essentially a sliding scale depending on how much you earn. So there is a calculator online for CCS to figure out how much they are covered for. But the way it's calculated is it starts at 90% coverage. And then for every $5,000 that you earn over about 80 grand a year, you get a 1% reduction in your coverage. And there's not only an income cap, but also an hourly rate cap. So what this essentially means is the government is saying they're really only willing to pay $14.63 per hour for your childcare. They're not really willing to subsidize anything above that. So if you send your child to an expensive center that charges $20 an hour, the government is saying we're only going to subsidize $14.63 of that, and you have to pay the extra $5 and change out of pocket. So this is where calculating it becomes complicated, and it's best to just use a calculator online. As an example, if you are a household that earns $200,000 per year and you send your child to a center that costs $200 a day, your out-of-pocket payment is still going to be about $100 per day. And then in terms of what type of income is included in that $535,000 cap I mentioned, it's really everything. It's your adjusted taxable income, which means it's all of your employment income and it's all other types of income. So if you have a rental property and you generate income from that, which is your revenue less your expenses, and you're making a profit, that's added in. If you have any capital gains, that's going to be added in. So this is something to keep in mind. You might have a one-off year where you sell, let's say, an investment property, or you sell a bunch of stock and you have a big gain. That's going to be added to your adjustable taxable income. And while you may have been previously under the threshold, that might even tip you over in any given year. You also have to add in any perks you get from your job. So let's say you get an employee car, those types of fringe benefits do get added back. Any salary sacrifice contributions into your superannuation, that all gets added as well. And it is a little bit of a balancing act here. For example, we're in February 2026 right now, which means that people don't know what their adjusted taxable income is going to be for the FY26 year. So you have to provide an estimate to Centrelink. If you happen to underestimate and you actually make more money than you thought you did, at the end of the year, you actually have to pay Centrelink back. If you overestimate how much you earn and you make less than you thought you did, then you actually get that subsidy at the end of the year as a lump sum. So if you want to avoid being hit with an unexpected bill at the end of the financial year, it is a strategy to overestimate your income and then get the benefit of a lump sum payment back from Centrelink. Keep in mind, Centrelink does actually withhold 5% of your subsidy because of those fluctuations that can happen. But if it were me, I would definitely be overestimating my salary so I didn't get hit with a bill at the end of the year. And it acts like forced savings. Another important thing to consider is if you have 2 or more children under the age of 5, then your childcare subsidy may potentially go up for the second child. So the way this works is that your first child will receive the standard rate that we have previously just gone over. But your second child is eligible for up to 95% coverage of their daycare fees. But there are caps to keep in mind of as well. If your family is earning less than about $143,000 per year, then you get that flat 95% covered. However, if your household income is above $367,000 per year, then you do not get this bonus sibling subsidy. You just revert back to the standard rate that I went over. It's a sliding scale depending on how much you earn. There is another special government subsidy just for children aged 3 and 4 in New South Wales, which is called the 2026 Start Strong Bonus. What this means is that you are entitled to between $515 and $2,100 per year to reduce your gap fee. So this is only available to 3 and 4-year-olds. And the good news about this is that it is not means tested, which means that everyone, regardless of your income, is entitled to this credit. If you want the maximum end of that bonus, you do have to send your child to a community preschool. You will not be getting the maximum of this bonus if you send your child to a long-service daycare, and community preschool is what we are going to be covering next. If you are outside New South Wales, well, lucky you, you actually get an even better, more generous deal. In Victoria and Queensland, you get free kindy. So it's free for everyone. So let's talk about some of the more qualitative pros and cons of daycare. So the pros of daycare is, number one, that convenience factor and flexibility. The really long hours, having all their meals prepared. It's also typically open at least 50 weeks a year. They also get that socialization with other children. They're building their immunity, as they say, with all the sickness. They do a lot of really fantastic activities with the kids, probably more creative than what you might be able to provide yourself at home. However, there are some downsides. One of the downsides of daycare is that they are for-profit business models, which means that many of them prioritize profits over quality of care. They also have higher staff turnover because of the nature of the work, the fact that it is a lot of shift work, and sometimes culture at some of these centers aren't that great, which might mean in a 6-month period, your child might go through a number of different educators. But I will say with daycare, it's hard to categorize them all in one bucket because there's such an enormous range. If you are sending your child to a large for-profit center that is not well run, that's going to be such a different experience than sending your child to a small family-owned boutique center where there's just a low number of children, for example. There is also sickness as a big downside, which any parent with kids in daycare will tell you all about. Also, long daycare can lead to fatigue. Doing a 10 or 11-hour day is quite a lot, and a lot of them do get daycare hangovers, which is also known as meltdowns later on in the evening. So those are some of the pros and cons of the model. Next, let's talk about community preschool. So unlike any of the other models I talk about today, community preschool is only available to children between 3 to 5 years old. It's essentially the 1 or 2 years before they start school. And community preschools are very much focused on school readiness. They're not for profit, which means anything that they make, they reinvest into the preschool itself. They also operate on much shorter schedules. It's really just like school. It's usually 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. or 4 p.m. School holidays are off. You cannot send your child in. You have to provide lunch. So it doesn't have the convenience factor that daycare does. So let's talk about the cost of community preschool. Community preschool is about half the price of daycare. It's between $50 to $100 per day in a city like Sydney, but they do have that 2026 Start Strong credit, which I mentioned earlier. And once that is applied, really you're only paying between $10 to $20 per day. And that, again, is available to every single person. It is not means tested. It doesn't matter how much you're working or how much you're making. Everybody gets it. So that's why preschool is so much cheaper as an option. It's also only a 2-day or 3-day program. So keep in mind, even if you do choose preschool when your child is, say, 4 years old, they're only going to have childcare for 2 to 3 days a week, and you have to figure out the rest of the week if you're working. Once again, if you're in Queensland or Victoria, you just get it for free. You don't have to worry about any credit. In South Australia, you get 15 hours fully funded. And in none of these states is it means tested. It's just available for everyone. It is universal. Some of the pros of preschool, definitely the socialization, the immunity building that you also would get in daycare as a group-based childcare option. It's a lot more affordable than daycare or any of the options we cover, quite frankly. On average, the quality is higher. And that's because not-for-profits are more likely to get exceeding on the national quality standard as compared to long service daycares. Also, because they are nonprofit, they reinvest all of the profits back into the center, and that usually goes back to the actual staff in terms of wages and resources. And therefore, you see a lot less turnover in a preschool. Many of them are university qualified early childhood teachers. The cons, the rigid hours. A 9 till 3 or 9 till 4 doesn't really work for parents that are working 9 to 5. Also, there are a few hidden costs to be aware of. School holidays are off, so you have to figure out additional care. So you should factor that into the cost if you have to pay for school holiday care. You also have to make your own lunches, provide food for your child, and that is another hidden cost of preschool. There might be other fees that the schools charge, as well as sometimes excursions. And keep in mind, that's only giving you 2 to 3 days of coverage. So if you do have to do that 5 days a week, you might also have to put them in long service daycare or one of the other options that we were going to talk about next. Also, it's worth mentioning that long service daycares also usually have a preschool program. And sometimes daycares call themselves preschool, which makes this additionally so confusing to try and figure out what's a community, not-for-profit preschool versus a long service for-profit daycare that has a preschool program. So a daycare with a preschool program, essentially when your child is 3 and above, they'll probably get moved into another room in the daycare center where they're more focused on academic readiness. Next on our list is nannies. So this is the first childcare service model that is a one-on-one ratio, unlike a daycare or a preschool. So what is a nanny? It is a working professional that comes to your home to care for your child. Typically, they have certifications and diplomas. In an expensive city like Sydney, it usually costs between $30 to $50 per hour, depending on the city that you live in, as well as whether they're a casual nanny or they're a full-time contracted nanny. Because if they're full-time contracted, they're probably commanding a lower rate per hour, but you obviously have them locked in for more hours per week and per year. Some of the hidden costs to think about with nannies on top of the hourly wage is if they are working more than 30 hours per week, technically you are their employer and therefore you are on the hook for superannuation, which means you have to pay them an extra 12%. A lot of people do pay nannies cash in hand, but that does come with its own risks and liabilities. So not only is it a tax risk if you are audited, it really comes down to the risk of uninsured liability. For example, a workplace injury or a relationship gone sour could potentially lead to years of back pay, ATO, tax penalties, and legal costs. The other hidden fees of a nanny, all of the consumables. So the food, not only for your own child, but possibly your nanny as well. Any excursions, getting those baby chinos when they're out at the park or taking them to the zoo, all of that you'd have to pay out of pocket, as well as any of the consumables at home, nappies, wipes, sunscreen, crafts, and activities that would all be on you to provide that. Also, any transport costs, as well as utilities. If you and your partner are out of the home working, you could potentially be saving on electricity and air conditioning and all of that. But if you have someone at your home all day, every day, that is going to actually add quite a bit to your utility bill. So the total cost of a nanny is significantly more than the other models that we've gone through. It's roughly $400 a week, and that assumes you're paying them about $40 per hour, 8 hours a day, on top of some of the other hidden costs. So in a week, that's around $2,000. So it's basically about double the cost of daycare. Of course, daycare, you get a CCS subsidy that helps tremendously with the cost if you're eligible. Whereas with nannies, you do not get CCS. 95% of the time, a nanny is an independent private arrangement that you pay out of pocket. The only way you would get CCS is if your nanny is an approved provider, and not many are. When you're comparing the costs of a nanny with a daycare, though, it's important to keep in mind it depends how many children you also have. So although a nanny is roughly double the cost, if you have 2 or 3 children and you do not get CCS, the math can definitely flip where a nanny might make more sense than to pay the cost of 2 children in daycare. In terms of the pros and cons of a nanny, some of the pros are that it's incredibly flexible. You don't have to do any drop off or pickup. They just come to your home. Also, a lot less sickness in those years when they're not around lots of other children. They can also help with household chores. They'll typically do the children's laundry, probably light meal prep and things like that for you. Some of the cons are mainly that it's the most expensive option, possibly requires you to be an employer, which is additional liability. And they would miss out on some of that socialization that children get in daycares. Next, let's talk about au pairs. Au pairs are cultural exchange participants. So they typically live in another country and come to Australia on a visa and stay with you and live with you between 6 to 12 months and provide all of your childcare needs. Unlike nannies who earn a professional wage, an au pair does not have the same professional qualifications. With au pairs, you typically just provide them with pocket money. In Sydney, on average, that's between $300 to $450 per week, but it can vary. And that typically covers between 30 to 35 hours of help per week. So it works out to be about $10 to $14 per hour. But there definitely are some hidden fees of au pairs. So the first one is the agency fee, which is typically between $1,200 to $2,000 per 6-month contract based on my research. And that covers everything from the vetting to the matching process to the background checks, absolutely everything so that you feel comfortable with the au pair. Food and utilities is the next one. Since they're living with you, you can certainly expect that your grocery bill and your utility bill, electricity, etc., is going to go up. Probably $100 to $150 per week is a reasonable estimate. Another hidden cost is the completion bonus. So it's pretty standard to provide your au pair with a bonus of between $500 to $1,000 at the end of their 6-month term. Also, there is transportation costs. They do not have a car, so you're going to have to provide all the petrol or actual car for them to drive your kids around. So I think a more realistic estimate for an au pair is probably between $750 to $950 per week. So that is certainly cheaper than a daycare option as well as a nanny. But with that weekly expense, keep in mind you also do not get any childcare subsidy. Some of the pros of an au pair is the cultural exchange program as itself. It can be a really awesome experience that's enriching for a lot of families. The extra hands around the house can be super helpful. Laundry, cleaning, grocery shopping, etc. It really does go beyond just childcare, especially in that 6 to 8 p.m. evening window, which you wouldn't get with some of the other models. The downside of an au pair is that you have a roommate you have to live with, and a lot of people our age are a bit over that phase of life. If you're someone that is lucky enough to have separate quarters, like a granny flat or a pool house or something like that, that could be a really comfortable arrangement. But then when you're thinking about the cost, you should also factor in any opportunity cost of rent that you could be getting from that space. The other con is that they are not professional educators. They do not have any certification. In Australia, the average age of an au pair is between 21 and 24 years old. Also, because of the short-term nature of it, they're usually on a 6-month contract. Your children might become quite attached only to say goodbye and have to start the process again with a new au pair. So the last childcare model I'm going to talk about is the stay-at-home parent model. Of course, it's a highly personal choice. But financially speaking, you might be asking yourself, at what point does it make more financial sense to quit my job instead of paying for childcare? And the answer to that is a bit of a complicated one. But financially speaking, it's the point at which your after tax pay, after childcare costs per hour is less than the value you place on your own time. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're a salaried employee and you're making $100,000 per year. Well, you're going to be taxed on that. So your after-tax take home would probably be around $70,000 per year. Now, keep in mind, if you're working and generating that income, your childcare subsidy is going to go down. Let's say your coverage drops from 60% covered to 40% covered because you are working. That also needs to be factored in. So really, you have to look at the before and the after to calculate which makes more sense for you. But if you were to do the math, you might find out that actually on an after-tax basis, once I also include the fact that my subsidy is lower, my hourly wage is less than minimum wage. That is unfortunately a reality. And if you value the time with your child more than that hourly rate, then it may make more sense for you to quit. However, there are significant hidden costs to being a stay-at-home parent. One of the biggest one is what's known as the motherhood penalty. If you've ever heard of this concept before, it is the unfortunate reality that you are not only losing a few years of salary, when you re-enter the workplace, you are commanding a much lower rate. Only about 55% of what you were previously earning is the typical motherhood penalty that women pay. Also, those years that you are not in the workforce, that means your employer is not contributing to your super. And that can be very significant because it's not only the years at which you are missing out on super, but it's also the compound interest and the growth that your super would have accumulated by the time that you retire. On average, taking a career break can mean a $160,000 difference by the time that you retire if you just take that 2 to 3 years off. So it's not just the short-term finances to think about, but that very big long-term impact. However, this is certainly not only a financial decision. This is very much a personal decision. And there are big pros and cons to this model, and it really depends on your unique family situation. Some of the pros are that you get that time back with your child. And how can you possibly put a dollar value on that? If that's what your heart truly desires, this time when your children are young, that is just time you will never get back. There's the benefit that you get to raise the child exactly how you want it, your values, how you want to parent. Nobody can provide a better level of care to your child than you as their parent. You have total control over the values, over the schedule, over everything. Also, it is scientifically proven to be less stressful for infants, so that's children under 2 years old, to be in a one-to-one care model. That doesn't have to be a stay-at-home parent, though. The research is also true for nannies. Some of the cons of this model, the biggest one is financially. But other cons include socialization and the possible impact to your mental health. It really depends. Do you want to be a stay-at-home parent, or is that actually not going to be what's best for you and your mental health, which therefore impacts on your children? We've gone through 5 different models of childcare in Australia in 2026. We talked about daycare, preschool, nannies, au pair, and the stay-at-home parent option. Hopefully, by going through all of the financials of each, as well as some of the more qualitative pros and cons, it can provide you with a more holistic picture of what is going to be the best childcare option for you and your family. So when it comes to which childcare option is the cheapest here in Australia, that is going to be daycare, assuming you get a childcare subsidy. If you do not get a childcare subsidy, then an au pair is the cheapest option based on our analysis. However, once your child turns 3 or 4, then you have the option of community preschool, which is hands down the cheapest option at only $10 to $20 per day. It's also important to keep in mind that you don't just have to pick one childcare model and stick with it. You might be better off choosing a hybrid approach of more than one of these options, depending on the phase of life in which you are in. So, as an example, for myself, when I was on maternity leave and I was technically a stay-at-home parent, I still had a nanny. And I'm giving you permission to also do the same. I had a nanny for only 5 hours a week, so it was very affordable, but it was just enough time so that I could actually have a little bit of time for myself to shower, take a nap, have my own appointments, do a workout. It was fantastic and honestly saved my mental health. Of all the millions of things that you spend money on when your child is born, I'm telling you, investing in help is going to be the greatest return on investment that you will possibly get. Now, when I went back to work full time, I no longer found the nanny option to be the most financially affordable, and therefore I chose a daycare route. My greatest advice is to tour as many centers as possible and try to get a good feel of different daycares. And it's hard when you're a first-time parent because you don't really know what to ask or what you're looking for. Don't be bedazzled by clever marketing or by shiny new equipment. It's really about the quality of educators that are at the center. And what you want is a center that prioritizes the well-being of their staff. And I think the best way that centers do that is ensuring that they have low ratios of children to educators. So finding a center that does not just go by the minimum legal requirement of ratios between educators to children, but actually has additional staff. I personally think that's one of the best indicators of a good daycare because it really reduces the risk of burnout and turnover in your staff, and staff are the heart and soul of a daycare center. When my child is 3 turning 4, I'm absolutely going to put them into a community preschool because of some of the benefits that I included above. But my strategy will be to continue with daycare and also add in preschool 2 days or 3 days a week, depending on the program that they get into. This is a very smart strategy for a lot of parents because you get the best of both worlds. You get the much more affordable, high quality care that a community preschool offers, but during school holidays, you still have the option of booking casual days with your current daycare, as well as the continuity of care, which is important because, of course, my son has established so many friendships and relationships at his daycare, and we'd be sad to leave them. Another strategy, if you are planning for baby number 2, and you already have a toddler who's in childcare, you might want to think of an approach where you use a nanny short term if you're concerned about the level of germs and sickness that a daycare can bring into your home when you have a newborn. There are horrific stories of babies ending up in ICU because of the germs of their siblings from childcare. So that is possibly another consideration, even though nannies are more expensive. There are also a couple more strategies that we did not get to cover in this episode. One is family daycare. So family daycare is kind of like a blend between a daycare and a nanny. They are people that open up their home as a daycare to a maximum of usually 4 children. So you kind of get the benefit in family daycare of those low ratios, low stimulation, but you still get the benefit of socialization. And family daycares are approved providers. Therefore, you're also eligible for CCS. Another option could be a nanny share. So I haven't done this personally, but I have heard some really positive stories of people who use the same nanny between two different families. So if you have someone that you really trust who's in your area, you could find a nanny that could take care of both of your children at the same time, and therefore you would share the cost of that. All right, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed the episode. This is super relevant for any parent with young children under the age of 5, but it is particularly helpful for anyone that you know that just had a baby and is trying to navigate this new world where they don't know up from down. So if you know any of those poor souls who are in the postpartum period or who are not yet at the point where they are having to make these decisions, please share this podcast. This is the information that I really wish that I had known earlier. It would have saved me a lot of heartache and hours of research. Before we close off the episode, I had a few burning questions that I really wanted answered, and I wanted to include a bit of a Q&A in this section. So one of the questions I had is, does the socialization that daycare provides actually give children a measurable advantage as compared to children who have a one-to-one model, which is care from, a nanny, au pair, or a stay-at-home parent? The short answer is that yes, it actually does, but primarily when the child is over 3 years old. So the research on this shows that the benefit of socialization that kids get is measurable. They actually score better on reading, math, and cognitive assessments than children who have at-home care. But the research also shows that under the age of 2, it's actually more stressful for infants, as measured by cortisol levels, to be in group care. And so for children under 2, it's actually more beneficial to have one-on-one type care. My second burning question, is daycare sickness something that is inevitable? Do kids that stay at home or have nannies just get sick later, or do daycare kids actually get more sickness? The short answer on this is you can pay that sickness tax now or you can pay it later, but you will pay it. The research does show that children who attend daycare get between 10 to 12 colds per year in the first year that they attend. Whereas if you don't go to daycare and you're a nanny kid, you're going to get 10 to 12 colds per year when you start primary school. So it really doesn't matter when your kid gets sick all the time. You're just going to have to go through this terrible phase. My third question is, what is the true cost of free care from grandparents? A lot of families rely on grandparent care, but is that really as good as it seems? There have been recent studies on this, and they actually show that children cared for solely by grandparents can sometimes have poorer general health outcomes because of less structured physical exercise, as well as possibly poor diet. There's also sometimes the emotional cost of grandparent care. According to this research, sometimes if that grandparent care can come with strings attached, such as not respecting the way that you want to parent, unsolicited parenting advice or guilt, not adhering to your wishes, it can often cause marital friction. So thank you so much for listening today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next week.